Welcome to The Diplomat. I'm your host, Joe Khouly. Today, we are looking at a negotiation that may define the next chapter of the Middle East or simply postpone its next crisis. The Musqat track between Washington and Tehran is moving quietly. No grand speeches, no signing ceremony so far, just signals, sanctions, and calibrated pressure. To help us unpack and understand what is really happening beneath the surface, we are joined by Ambassador Deniz Ross, counselor and distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and one of the most experienced American diplomats in modern Middle East diplomacy. He has served under many presidents, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama, playing a central and important role in Arab-Israeli negotiations, arms control, and US policy toward Iran and the broader region. So what is actually happening here? Crisis management, strategic reset, or something far narrower? So let's begin there.
Look, it's pretty clear that President Trump would like to be able to do a deal with the Iranians if he could. The question is not whether he wants to do a deal. The question is whether or not the kind of deal he has in mind, the Iranians are prepared to live with or to accept. He wants them to give up the right to enrich. He wants there to be zero enrichment because he sees that as related to what he says, no nuclear weapons. That's what he's been clearest on, although he recently gave an interview in which he said no nuclear weapons, no missiles. The Iranians are saying the only thing they will talk about is their nuclear program, and even then they're saying zero enrichment's not on the table. What they're each saying publicly doesn't make it appear as if there's a deal that's possible. Now, what oftentimes is said in public is not necessarily mirrored by what's said in private. The fact that the president yesterday on Truth Social, after seeing Prime Minister Netanyahu, said that he, the president, insisted that diplomacy be pursued to see if there was a deal possible. He hoped there was. He hoped the Iranians understood what the consequences would be if there wasn't. But he used the word, he insisted, which says this was not something that Prime Minister Netanyahu was necessarily eager to hear. And so what that tells me, he has heard enough from his negotiators, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, to believe that what the Iranians are saying in public is not being matched by what they're saying in private. Now, maybe the next meeting will reveal that there isn't a gap between what's being said in public and private, but he's certainly been led to believe that there is a reason to keep talking and that there is a possibility of reaching a deal. I've also seen that Ali Laranjani, who went to Oman, and he's obviously very close to the supreme leader, was at least implying that if you could solve the nuclear issue, then you could discuss the ballistic missiles. So it's not as if there are no hints that something might be possible. The question is, are these hints designed just to buy time, to sort of engage the administration in a negotiation, and the longer it goes on, it becomes harder then to use force? The president has said a number of things, that he wants to do a deal, but you can't really trust the Iranians. They haven't, his words, they haven't been honest. So it looks to me like you're seeing a lot of posturing, a lot of maneuvering, and what I'll be watching for is, okay, when does this next meeting take place? And what comes out of it?
So when you look at the Oman channel right now, how do you define it?
Well, it's clearly a device that the Iranians want to use to say they're not negotiating directly with the administration, although it's pretty clear that they actually do meet directly when they're there. So this is part of an effort to sort of disguise the readiness to actually talk directly after the Supreme Leader had said that they wouldn't talk directly. I look at it as a kind of, on each side, was kind of probing to see what might be possible.
There are a few voices in Washington, D.C., some think tanks. Let's mention FDD. They published an article, and they headline was, "Negotiating with Iran is wrong. doing so in Oman is worse. How do you see that? Is it like an obstacle toward what this administration is trying to do to see Oman as a mediator?
I don't have a problem in the abstract with having help or a third party help, especially given the difference in perceptions. I did have a problem with the way this was done. If you go back to the Biden administration, Iran refused to meet directly, said it would only meet with the other members, the European members, or the other members of the 5+1. I thought it was a huge mistake to give in to that. I would have accepted the idea if the Biden administration said, we'll meet one time in this way indirectly. But you're not serious if you're not prepared to talk directly. And we're only going to engage in negotiation that's serious. Here, the meeting was going to be held in Ankara, and others were going to be available. And then suddenly Iran says, no, it has to be Oman. Here again, my approach would have been, we'll meet in Oman one time. But if the ground rules before you change them, we're to be in Ankara, and we will. If you're serious, then you'll meet there.
So, from Washington's perspective, what would a minimally acceptable understanding look like today?
I think it would involve the following elements. Number one, zero enrichment. It doesn't mean that we've heard there's a long American approach that says, let's create a regional center for enrichment, which will then provide enriched material to all those who want civil nuclear power. And if what the Iranians want is civil nuclear power, as opposed to the option for nuclear weapons, that should be acceptable. And that would mean zero enrichment. Now, they may push for the enrichment, this center should be in Iran. I would say no to that. Maybe after 10 years and there's been unmistakable demonstration of performance, you could think about having more than one center. I'm not saying it's necessarily in Iran, but basically you could have more than one center. But on the issue of enrichment, no enrichment within Iran. That has to be, it's not possible to produce an agreement without that.
You played a central role in U.S.-Iran policy when you worked with different presidents. You think from Tehran's side, if you want to explain it, what would make a deal politically survivable for them?
It's an excellent question, because the supreme leader has always talked about any concession you make to the arrogant power, meaning us, is never going to be enough. I think what governs them is whatever they can get away with. They would like to give the absolute minimum, and what they want in return is a complete lifting of sanctions. On our side, you want a demonstration that they're serious about being prepared to accept an outcome where there won't be enrichment on their territory. If there's not enrichment on their territory, you've crossed a historic threshold. Iran in previous circumstances wasn't prepared to accept that. The question is today, their needs are so profound. I think the regime is not just vulnerable because they have no air defense. They're vulnerable because they have a population that is angry, sullen, rejects the regime. The regime's proof of how it understands where its public's coming from is it still hasn't renewed the internet in any meaningful way. It still doesn't trust its public, and it killed in the space of 2 or 3 days thousands of people without the slightest qualm.
But we were talking with a former CIA officer mentioning how the United States put red lines for killing protesters and then not moving toward any action. Now the protesters are not on the table. It's a nuclear deal at the table. How do you see that?
I think you got to be very careful when you're president to spell out what you're going to do and not do, but then if you say you're going to do something, then you do it. In this case, we know that expectations were raised in Iran among the people. And those expectations were clearly disappointed. The president said help is on the way. And they didn't see help on the way. Instead, they saw mass killing. So I think in the eyes of the Iranian public, there's probably real doubts about what we will do. It does also seem, I know the Secretary of State laid out basically 4 areas: zero enrichment, shipping out all the highly enriched uranium, limits on the ballistic missiles, sizes and range, ending support for the regional proxies, and how Iran treats its public. Now, how Iran treats its public, the one thing you can guarantee they will not concede is that, because that's conceding the regime itself. But can they concede on the other issues? They don't want to. And they may even, the Supreme Leader might even view the dissonance, accepting that even this would threaten the regime. But a new conflict is going to threaten them more.
Both sides talk about leverage, sanctions, military signaling, regional alliances. What leverage does Washington genuinely hold right now? And what leverage does Tehran believe it holds?
And again, it's a good question. The leverage on the American side is a huge force buildup. The president's not exaggerating. It's a huge force buildup. And it's a buildup that also puts us in a position where we can defend against what they do while carrying out a very serious set of offensive operations. On their side, they perceive President Trump as someone who uses force but likes to do it in a one-and-done fashion. And they're trying to signal this will not be one and done. We'll attack all your assets. We'll attack your assets, your friends. So their leverage is he doesn't really want to get into a prolonged conflict with them. The paradox, of course, is the last thing they want is to get into a prolonged conflict with us.
Any serious agreement with Iran, can it realistically sidestep the armed groups or proxies aligned with Tehran across Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen? Or does regional posture inevitably bleed into the negotiation space?
I think it cannot, for a simple reason. The Iranians want sanctions relief. And the sanctions relief is a lifeline to this regime. So if you're giving a lifeline to this regime, you shouldn't be making it possible for them to continue to support militarily and economically Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, some of it's a mixed bag of the Shia militias within Iraq. But yeah, if you're providing sanctions relief, in a sense, you're providing the ability of them to support these groups on the outside. We should not be doing that.
But when we see flare-ups in Iraq, Syria, or maritime arenas, how directly should we connect those events to bargaining dynamics?
I'm not so sure that's what's driving the bargaining dynamics from the Iranian side. I think the posturing to make it clear that this will be a prolonged conflict, that all our bases will be attacked, that this is not going to be something that will be quick. I think that's where they think they have leverage, because they're convinced that President Trump doesn't want to get into that kind of a conflict. The irony is, whenever you make a threat, it should be a threat you're prepared to carry out. And the truth is, they don't really want to get into a prolonged conflict with us, because that will also threaten all the control mechanisms of the regime itself.
Is there any way to verify a model for de-escalation? Geographic red lines, reduced transfers, clearer command structures, or is that simply beyond the realm of negotiable reality?
I don't think it's beyond the realm of negotiable realities. Look, you can negotiate on the issue of ballistic missiles by saying, okay, you're not going to have any intercontinental range ballistic missiles. Or you can say you will limit the range of ballistic missiles to 300 miles. So there's an answer for that. On the issue of the proxies, you provide no military weapons whatsoever to the proxies. You want to support them politically? Okay. You want to even support them economically? Well, I would expect us to indirectly contribute to that.
Syria, the unresolved file. Iran's footprint in Syria has evolved over more than a decade. How entrenched is it now within Syria's security architecture, you think?
I don't think they're that entrenched. I think what's entrenched are obviously the groups that were under the umbrella of HTS. You see the remnants of them incorporated into the current military forces, and I think that's where there is a legitimate question to ask. How much control does Ahmed al-Shara have over all of the forces that ostensibly are under his command? Now, the fact that he was able to employ them in a way that seemed pretty effective against the Kurds indicates that he has some control. But what we saw, in Sueda, what triggered all of that seemed to be forces that he had very little control over.
If a narrow nuclear understanding is reached and Syria is left untouched, where does Iran's role there realistically head over the next 5 years? Because we've seen Washington moving between lifting sanctions, but in a way also trying to write new paths to different sanctions. Is that realistic? Are there historical parallels we should be paying attention to here?
The president lifted the Caesar sanctions against al-Shara in Syria. He did it even though there were a lot of people within his own administration who thought he should only do that in stages. But he did it all at once because he said, look, I believe that President al-Shara is someone who is going to change Syria, and it's a strategic gain, and I want to, in effect, invest in him now. Iran, in my mind, has very little it can be a spoiler in Syria, and I think it's trying to be a spoiler in Syria. I think the question of our sanctions, one of the issues is you have legally mandated sanctions, you have executive branch sanctions. Executive branch sanctions the president can lift with a snap of a finger. The legally ones, it requires time, and he has to use his own political capital to get those lifted. The bigger issue, ironically, is it's not even the sanctions that are legally imposed that are as much a problem as, even if you got them lifted, are American banks and financial institutions ready to go invest in Iran? There's something called the Financial Action Task Force, and it deals with the issue of money laundering and things of that sort, which requires all sorts of reforms within the Iranian banking system and a kind of transparency to show that monies are not going to the Houthis or to Hezbollah or to Hamas. Iran has never been prepared to take those kinds of steps. So in answer to your question, a lot is possible, but they will have to take steps where there's a kind of full transparency. In a circumstance where they do that, I think for someone like Ali Khamenei, this in itself means he's giving up the Islamic Republic. This has been part of who they are. So whether he's capable of doing that, I don't know. My suspicion is he's not capable of doing it. The question I have is, if you go back to 1988, when Moussaoui was the prime minister and Rafsanjani was a major player, he wasn't the president, but he was a major player, and the two of them went to Khomeini and said, you have to end the war with Iraq because we can't sustain it. The question is there anybody like that around him today who could go to Khamenei and say, you are risking now the Islamic Republic if you don't take these steps?
If you want to explain, based on years of diplomacy that you worked on many of these files in the region, to talk about this coercive diplomacy, how would you characterize the current U.S. approach? How much is it effective?
Well, we don't know yet.
How long do we have to wait?
Well, it's a very good question. I know the president said, look, these ships have to float somewhere. That's actually not the case. They come from someplace. Every carrier battle group has about 5,500 personnel. So there's wear and tear on the ship and all the equipment on the ship. There's wear and tear on all the people on the ship. There is, I think, a kind of sell-by date. On a milk carton, there's a sell-by date. I don't know exactly what it is, but there will be pressures coming from the military to say, look, we are not able to keep this array of forces out here without some additional rotation and some going back to port. So I don't know how soon that is. I think it helps to create some kind of deadline. Let's bear in mind one thing. President Trump gave the Iranians 2 months. When the Israelis struck, it was on day 61. He gave them 60 days, and on day 61, the Israelis struck. It's hard for me to believe that he probably isn't again imposing a deadline here.
But this time, how much do you fear that if there's any strike, it's going to be an escalation for a long standing war, not just like a quick strike like what happened last time? There are so many voices in Washington, D.C. are warning that this would not to make it another Iraq war or another Libya, where the war would have many repercussions, negative repercussions on the region, from refugees to neighboring countries to other things. How and when you look at the mix of demands, deterrence, and signaling, where is the greatest structural risk of unintended escalation?
Well, I think you're putting your finger on it, that this is, even if President Trump and the Iranians don't want this to be a long war, the Iranians may signal they're prepared to make it a long war. They understand that imposes a big risk on them. So whatever they're signaling, they really don't want it to be a long war. President doesn't want it to be a long war, but you're putting your finger on what could be the risk. Both sides can want something, but a conflict ends up having its own dynamic. You hit a set of targets, and the targets cause more casualties than were anticipated. Then it creates an impulse on the side who suffered that to raise the ante. But once you raise the ante and you impose something, let's say that the Iranians hit some targets, up until now, every time they struck, in the aftermath of the Soleimani killing, they hit the al-Assad base in Iraq, but they signaled in advance they were going to do it. The same with Al-Udeid. They signaled after near the end of the 12-day war, they signaled in advance they were going to do it. The forewarning was designed to limit the possibility of real casualties, to limit the possibility that we would do something in response, but also to signal, look, we're taking a deliberately calibrated step, so this is a signal to you that we'll keep things under control. Unless you do the same thing again, you run the risk that you could be more successful than you intended, what oftentimes is referred to as catastrophic success. If they have a catastrophic success, can Trump back down?
Many who are familiar with how President Trump thinks, he doesn't like messy things or any business that he is involved with to get messy. Is this classic coercive diplomacy, pressure paired with an off-ramp, or are we closer to a miscalculation threshold than policymakers admit?
I think anybody who feels a high degree of confidence right now that they can predict exactly how this ends is either kidding themselves or probably kidding anybody else that they're talked to about it. I would say we're closer to the latter than to the former. I would just qualify it by saying neither side wants this to go on for a long time, for the reason you said about President Trump, but as I was saying about this regime. This regime is weak now. It has no air defense. It literally has no air defense. It is in a position where it cannot defend itself from attacks that would be coming. The kinds of attacks on its whole control set of mechanisms. Maybe they can't destroy the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij, but they can weaken them. And what is that going to mean to a public that is quite angry right now over what the regime did? The regime could be creating the seeds of its own destruction, or it could be creating the seeds, frankly, of a coup. So the irony is they both want to keep it short. They both want to convince the other that the price is too high. Trump wants to convince the Iranians that the price is too high for them to do a deal. The Iranians want to convince Trump the price is too high for you, so do a deal on our terms. So can they control what might be set in motion? They might have a huge stake in it, But whether they can actually do it is another question.
How are the regional actors interpreting this Muscat channel? Do Israel, Jordan, the Gulf see it as a genuine off-ramp, a holding pattern, or the prelude to something more destabilizing?
It's interesting. I think in the case of Israel, we got an indication of that yesterday when the president used the word, he insisted, I'm putting in quotes the word insisted, that he would pursue diplomacy now. That suggests that Prime Minister Netanyahu, at a minimum, expressed his skepticism. And then he subsequently issued a statement saying the president thinks that diplomacy needs to be given a chance. He's personally skeptical, but the president's going to pursue that. So there clearly was a difference on that. I think with the others in the region, I think they're hopeful of avoiding a conflict. Because I think the others in the region are worried this is a conflict that has its own dynamic and you don't know how and when it stops. Do they trust the Oman Channel? I don't know. I think the Omanis have a way of wanting to put the best face on whatever message they're communicating because they want this to succeed and they don't want it to collapse. The problem is, and I can say it's from a lot of experience in negotiations, one thing you never want in a negotiation is a misunderstanding, because parties never look at the misunderstanding as being innocent. They always think it was deliberate. Even when it is innocent, they think it's deliberate. And I'm not sure, maybe the Omanis are a very good channel and they just present things exactly they are and they don't try to put a positive gloss on it. But I would have a concern. And I have a feeling that others in the region are a little bit uneasy about that as well.
And finally, what indicators are you watching most closely now?
What I'm watching for is, okay, when's the next meeting and what comes out of the next meeting? If the next meeting itself comes out and there's a reference to the fact that there's an agreed agenda or an agreed framework, then I'll feel, all right, this is now a negotiation. It doesn't mean it's going to be successful, but it means this is a negotiation that's going to go on for a while. And maybe it has the possibility of success. If they have another meeting and it's not clear when the next one is, when there's no reference to a kind of agreed agenda, then I think these negotiations may not be long for what we have to say.
What will tell you that we are moving toward a narrow technical deal, a broader strategic shift, or a slide toward confrontation?
The main thing for me will be, do they talk about an agreed agenda? Because if there's an agreed agenda, even if it's an agreed sequence, maybe the explanation or justification for the Iranians will be it's nuclear first and then ballistic missiles and then maybe regional proxies. And for us, it would be they've agreed that they will engage on those. So even if they have a different explanation of what the agenda and framework is, if it's clear it's continuing and at least they know what topics they're dealing with and when, that tells me that this is not just going to be a kind of exercise that's about to collapse. That will tell me that this has a possibility. It won't tell me we're going to have a deal, but it will tell me there's a possibility and there's increasing investment in it on both sides.
Thank you for being with us, Mr. Ambassador. This moment feels quiet, but quiet diplomacy often carries the loudest consequences. Whether Muscat becomes a bridge or just a pause depends less on headlines and more on political will and how each side defines dignity and security. We will continue to watch the signals, not just the statements. Thank you for listening to The Diplomat. Until next time.